Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks everyone for joining this morning. So as Tim said, I lead a research group at Bloomberg that covers the transition of the food and agricultural sector. We use data. The team's role is to use data to uncover the opportunities and the risks that will emerge through transition. So why do we do this? Why is the food and agricultural system under transition? Well, it's always innovating in many ways, but actually what we're now confronting and what corporations along the value chain are appreciating is the enormous environmental impact of the food and agricultural system. What does that look like? It looks like roughly a third of global emissions are attributable to the food system. That's all the way through the value chain. Roughly 90% of global deforestation, and it is the primary culprit of freshwater withdrawal and plastic pollution. And companies along the value chain are responding by setting really ambitious targets to address those emissions. Roughly 4/5 of large multinational agri-food companies, those with over $1 billion of annual revenue, have set an emission reduction target. Roughly 2/3 have set a net zero target. And the scope varies here, but more than half of those firms that have set a net zero target have set a target that relates to what's called scope 3, all emissions that's encapsulated by their product. That's to say they've set a net zero target that applies to the fertilizer produced, to how it's applied, to the on-field emissions, through to how the grain or protein is transported all the way through to the refrigerator. And the timing varies here as well. In most cases, you'll see there's commitments being made for 2040 or 2050. 2040 certainly seems very soon. And most have a near-term check-in around 2030. So these targets are approaching very, very quickly. The problem here, of course, is that for many of these firms, they are a long way from the farmer, but 4/5 of their emissions occur on the farm. That is to say that anyone downstream needs to find ways to reduce emissions of a producer whether they have no relationship to and in many cases can't even name and locate. So why is this occurring? Now, I've got a very simplified value chain here, but products flowing down through the value chain from inputs through producers all the way down to consumers. The typical narrative you hear is that consumers are demanding more sustainable food. If that were true, the response from retailers and from food producers is quite simple: substitute. Overnight, we can swap products on the shelves to something that doesn't have those environmental impacts. But actually what we see is the real pressure is coming from other places in the value chain. Finance, investors, shareholders, insurers are critiquing these companies for their environmental performance. Policy, regulation, and reporting obligations are shifting quickly, both domestic and abroad. That means this pressure cascades back up the value chain, really being concentrated on the producer. Agri-food companies as a whole have found this instrument they want to scale to deliver this: regenerative agriculture. It's central to many of these firms' scope 3 emission reduction targets. A group like PepsiCo, a 2040, so quite near-term net zero target, sees regenerative agriculture as the central pillar, I would argue the only pillar, of their scope 3 reduction target. And it's not just Pepsi, it's across the entire value chain. Wholesalers like ADM, retailers like Sainsbury, all using regen as their central mechanism to deliver scope 3 emission reductions for farmers that they may or may not have relationships with. So we've looked at over 130 of these of agri-food companies, global agri-food companies, all large, $1 billion plus revenue, implementing around 188 regenerative agriculture targets and 250 odd regenerative agriculture programs. So it's a large universe of companies driving change here. Roughly half of those companies have implemented a target that relates to regenerative agriculture or sustainable agriculture. I'm being really generous here with the definitions. If a company says they have a regenerative agriculture target or program, I'm calling it regenerative agriculture. I'll come back to that later. If they're saying it has environmental benefits or reduces emissions, I'm calling it sustainable agriculture. But what you see is actually across the value chain, it's fairly consistent. These companies are implementing projects that apply to the farmer, regardless of whether they're next door as the wholesaler or whether they're miles away on the other side of the world as a retailer. Most commonly, the targets relate to the ingredient sourced. So that is really the most hands-off way to set a target. It's left to the procurement department. They just need to meet a share of a commodity purchased or a volume of commodity purchased that they can say is from a regenerative or a sustainable source in any given year. Next most common, or the second most common, relates to area. So this is a bit more hands-on. Suddenly you need to think about, well, I'm guaranteeing that a certain area of land will be transformed into regenerative or sustainable agricultural practices. In aggregate, these firms have committed to 316 million acres to be converted to regenerative practices by 2030. That's an area roughly the size of the Northern Territory. So it's a significant number, but what you see in this chart is that they are not on track. They are far off track toward delivering upon those promises. Just 5 companies have disclosed an investment target, totaling roughly $2.5 billion US. Now, there's a lot more money moving into regenerative agriculture at the program level. Once you announce a program, there is money being committed, sometimes to the farmer, quite often not, just to enabling services. But very few companies have made a commitment to how much they will spend to deliver upon their longer-term target. No companies, this is really quite alarming, no companies have disclosed the anticipated emission reduction from their regen targets. There's some firms here that we're able to reverse engineer what they're likely to get from regenerative agriculture, but whilst these firms are using regen ag as the central pillar of the decarbonisation target, they don't want to commit to what it's actually going to deliver. And understandably, it applies to a wide basket of goods, a wider range of commodities. But those commodities are not always aligned with where emissions tend to occur within the agricultural system. It's a mixture of fats, proteins, specialty crops, some fibre, but really what we're seeing here is a bit of a misalignment between emissions and commitments. And the real kicker, actually, is what do they define as regenerative agriculture? So I said before, if they call it regen, I'll take it for now. But actually what you see here, we've looked across all these firms and what they're actually doing with regenerative agriculture, and it's all very, very different, and very few of the practices they're implementing can be guaranteed to lead to emission reductions, can reduce emissions. There are more practices that could potentially lead to sequestration, but some question marks over that. But what you see here is that roughly over a third of agri-food companies don't define regenerative agriculture whatsoever. They've committed to regenerative agriculture targets, but won't tell you what that is. A bit over a third use their own definitions and put that in their press release, in their sustainability documents. And only a quarter of agri-food companies use a third-party framework, such as the Sustainable Agricultural Initiative here in grey. So amongst these 5 firms I've got here, they've all defined regenerative agriculture for themselves. But look just how different what they term regenerative agriculture is. And actually just how inconsistent, especially around things like fertiliser use and manure optimisation, that will lead to emission reduction. All 5 of those firms, in their press releases, in their sustainability documents, say the primary reason for doing regenerative agriculture for them is carbon outcomes. So what does this mean? It means that even if all these targets were to be hit, the net zero commitments, the emission reduction commitments were to be achieved, and we are not on track to achieve those targets, let's be clear, we'd likely see a roughly 40% reduction in the emissions of the food system by 2050. If they meet those targets, and that's again very unlikely, we will be far off a trajectory consistent with the Paris Agreement or consistent with under 2 degrees of warming. So what does that mean? The future looks like one with more likely intense weather events and more frequent crop losses. Luckily, these agri-food companies do have tools to deal with that too. It in fact is the same tool. So whilst regenerative agriculture today is positioned by these companies as their way of reducing emissions, actually we're likely to see in the future that they'll need to lean more heavily on these programs to scale resiliency in their supply chains. We'll be moving away from the grey pathway and not believing the press releases that claim emission reductions, but instead focusing on the blue pathway that talks about resiliency and profitability. And they'll need to scale it quickly. But if there's one market that knows how to scale sustainable production quickly and over massive industries and a variety of commodities, it's the Australian farming industry. So a lot of the templates that can be applied or have been experienced and deployed already in Australia will be relevant here. Thank you very much.